for you guys. There's also another session, Lightning Roadmap for admins, which I also highly encourage you to attend if you're interested in that as well. But this is much more about the developer and the programmatic types of technologies that you would use in order to build Lightning components and new experiences with Salesforce. So I'm Ryan Ellis. I see some faces that I recognize out here. I've been at Salesforce for 10 years. And I started at Salesforce actually creating the App Exchange. So I've been part of the platform and this ecosystem for quite a long time. I then later on became responsible for what we called ALM, or Application Lifecycle Management. So technologies like Sandbox, metadata, the tooling API, things of that nature. And then in the last year or so, I've been responsible for what we call the Lightning Foundation, which are really all of the developer-facing technologies that make up Lightning. And really excited to be here with you today. I'm also joined by Desi here in the audience in the front. She leads engineering for that effort, and she's going to help with answering some of the questions as we get towards the end. As I said, this is a roadmap session, so we have our wonderful forward-looking statements. So please don't make any purchasing decisions based upon what I tell you here, but only what's publicly available. In brief, we're really only going to cover 3 major topics here today, and I want to make sure to have ample time for questions and answers at the end. First of all, Visualforce. How many of you in the room are using Visualforce in some way? OK, everybody. How many in the room are using Lightning Experience or starting to dabble with it? OK, so many of you. So for all of you who've been using Visualforce, as you start using Lightning, you're going to start looking at how you're going to be using Visualforce in the context of Lightning. And so that's what this is really about, is how does Visualforce evolve in the world of Lightning and Lightning Experience. The second section is going to be all about Lightning components. And how many of you are building Lightning components today? So a good number of you as well. So that will be more about the pure play Lightning components themselves, the new components that we're delivering, the new services to enable them, and some of the tooling around that. And then the last piece here will be the Lightning services. So you may have heard in the keynote earlier this morning talking about the Lightning Data Service. That's just one of the services that we provide. I'll be expanding on the roadmap for that, as well as some other new services that we're providing. And then we'll go into the Q&A. So first, let's talk about Visualforce. So when we started to do this Lightning journey, one of the things that we realized very quickly was that you guys, our customers, our partners in the world, have invested very heavily in developing Visualforce pages. Visualforce has been around for about a decade. And I think at last count, it was something like 15 or 16 billion transactions of Visualforce each month. So it's very well adopted and really is going to be here to stay. And so we wanted to make sure that Visualforce was able to work very well within the Lightning experience. It took us a couple of releases to get it to be working at all, quite frankly, because it's a very different technology. It's a server-side-centric technology as opposed to the Lightning experience itself, which is mostly client-side. But after a couple of releases, we were able to move it into a GA state. Here's an example of what you would see, which is just a simple list view, just one-line tag of Visualforce shown inside of a Lightning tab. Now, the first thing that many people will notice about this is it works. The second thing that they'll notice about it is it's kind of ugly. It looks like the old experience inside of this new experience, which doesn't really look like the old experience. And for some people, that's OK. All they really care about is that it works and they move on. But for many of us, we really don't like that. And we want to make it into the most seamless experience for our end users as is possible. And so we've gone down a series of different paths to try to make this easier for you in order to make this experience feel more similar to the other Lightning experience. The first thing that we did was that we encouraged you to use a static resource where you would upload a version of the Lightning design system and then use that to try to restyle this experience yourself. Some people did that and had some success with that. But one of the things that they quickly realized was that the markup of Visualforce and the markup that was expected by the design system were different. And so what they ended up having to do was do some hacking of CSS to try to make it work, which could be done, but was a real pain in the ass. And so then what we did was we said, it also sucks that everyone is uploading the same static resource over and over again. It just bloats the system. I have to now load that thing many different times. So the next thing we did was we made SLDS, that's the design system, made that be available directly from within here. So you can just use a tag and then just reference it here without having to upload a static resource. So that was one step better. But at the same time, still we had the problem of a mixing of the markup of Visualforce with the markup of SLDS. And so we went back to the grindstone here and decided that really what we needed to do was make it just work. Just like what you all expect out of Salesforce, you just expect it to work. And that's one of the beautiful things about our platform is we try to make all of these very seemingly complicated things quite simple. And so here you can see that exact same contact list, but in this case, styled like lists look in this experience. In order to do this, what we are doing is that we're actually creating a parallel implementation of the Lightning design system that is mapped to Visualforce's markup. It will only be accessed there and used there, but we have been successful in making all of the standard components of Visualforce look and feel like the rest of Lightning experience. This is something that you will opt into. And what I mean by that is on a page-by-page level, you will specify in the tag, in the header of the page, you will say, turn this style sheet on or don't turn this style sheet on. By default, it will be off, so it'll look like whatever it looks like. This isn't free for you. The only reason I want to say that is because many times, this is sort of a special case, right? This is just a single standard Visualforce component. But many of you, of course, will combine together standard Visualforce components with your own code that you have created with its own styles. And we don't know anything about those. And so those will, of course, continue to look like whatever you've made them look like. And so you'll need to adapt those into this look and feel as well. But we hoped to make it a little bit easier for you, at least with standard out-of-the-box things. And we found that I believe it's something like 55% of all Visualforce pages use only standard components, don't use a single line of custom CSS. And so for those, they would essentially magically look like this. So I do encourage you when we release this in the next release to check it out, turn it on some of your pages, see if it's helped you. This is a supported thing, whereas before what many people have done is they've essentially hacked on top of our CSS, which at any time might break because our CSS is not an API. So I encourage you to take a look at this as you see this will come out in the winter release. Some more things on Visualforce. So another thing that people have told us a lot is, my God, I have so many Visualforce pages, and as I'm in the process of moving from Classic to Lightning experience, I don't know where to start. We experienced this ourselves at Salesforce. We have one of the largest implementations of Salesforce around, as you might imagine. We had something like 1,600 Visualforce pages, and that was a lot of pages for our IT organization to start thinking about consuming and moving forward with. And so the first thing that we did, because we have our own special magic powers internally, was we ran a whole bunch of information on logs and came back, and we were able to tell our IT team, well, these are the pages that are used the most often. So why don't you start from the top and then go down and sort of prioritize? We wanted to give the same capability to you, our customers, and our developers. And so we introduced the Visualforce Usage API. The Usage API is just like any other API that we have at Salesforce. You can call this against your org, and it will return back to you the number of page views for each Visualforce page that you have in the last 30 days. And so you'll be able to take all that information, last 90 days. You'll be able to take that information. You could actually store it off somewhere if you want to. We'll always just give you the last 90 days, because that's how much we keep in our logs. But you could store it off and keep it over time and see how it works. Obviously, this is useful information for many reasons, right? If you wanted to understand how your end users were using which pages more than other pages, like this is a feature you could use for that. But our primary purpose around this was to help people attack the problem of migrating to Lightning experience. In addition to that problem, we wanted to make it easier for people to, on a single page, figure out what they needed to do to migrate it to Lightning experience. And we wrote a nice long trailhead, which many of you have taken in that module, that went through and said, beware of this, and don't do this, and if you've done this in this page, you should do it this way instead. And that's a great tool, but it meant someone had to actually read a Trailhead module, and then they had to actually parse through the code themselves and figure it out. And so we decided to try to, again, make those things simpler for you. And so we're going to be introducing this thing called the Visualforce Analyzer, which how many of you guys have taken the readiness check, which is like that button you click in Setup, and it spits out, OK, not enough of you have done that. So for those of you who have not done that, if you go into Setup, there's a thing called the Lightning Readiness Check, which if you click it, it basically runs a report. It runs the metadata and tooling API against your org, comes back, and gives you a whole bunch of information about your org and how it might work in Lightning Experience. So go ahead and try that. Click it. It'll just generate a PDF and send it to you. So this is similar to that, but it's specific for Visualforce. So it'll analyze your Visualforce pages, and it'll come back and say, this page looks OK, and this page, you have to watch out on line 5 because you're calling window.location, and you can't do that because this is running as an iframe. You should do this instead. So this will be a great tool to help you narrow down that 1,600 pages that I mentioned down to some smaller set with some very, very clear action items of what you're supposed to do. So hopefully these tools together will help you in your journey of moving your Visualforce pages to Lightning Experience. So this is future. So the analyzer is going to be coming out in, I believe, is July, because it's off cycle. It's like a separate tool that runs against your org as opposed to your org itself. The usage API actually just came out in the summer release. So a last word on Visualforce and Visualforce with Lightning components in general. These two things are going to live together. We really don't think that people are going to, generally speaking, just lift up and throw away all their Visualforce and move over entirely purely to Lightning components. Certainly, maybe some people will do that. People who start with a fresh new org, maybe they'll do that. But for many of us, we're going to have these things living side by side. And it's important to figure out how these things can interoperate and communicate with one another. And as part of that, we wrote a blog, which I'd encourage all of you guys to check out. It's called Communicating Between Lightning Components and Visualforce Pages, a fairly straightforward name. You can find it on the developer blog. It gives some very clear examples of how to make these types of things interoperate. An example of this might be, I've got a big page. I've got a section over here that is a Visualforce section. I've got a thing over here that's a Lightning component that I've created. I twiddle something over here, and I want the thing over there to update, right? So this will give you examples of how to try to make those types of things happen. So continuing forward with Lightning components. So the big thing I want to talk about here is something that we call base components. How many of you know what a base component is? OK, a good number of you do. So base components, it's like Legos, right? When you go and you buy a big Lego set, you get a whole bunch of little bits. The little bits are what we call the base components. And of course, they come in different shapes and sizes. And if you have the square piece that's a 2x4, maybe one of the variables on it is what's its color? Is it red, or is it blue, or is it green? We have the same type of concept with base components. In the context of Lightning Experience, these are things like an icon or a button or input or spinner. For the most part, these things they're kind of universally true. You'll find these things in other types of UI frameworks that you look for out in the world. But there are some that are specific to Salesforce and Salesforce's logic, a thing like lookup, for example, which is tightly bound to Salesforce metadata. So one of the things that we've heard a lot of feedback from you, our developers, is that we don't have enough of these things, and that we provide you some good ones, but you find that you're reinventing the wheel and building things that you expect that you should be getting out of the box. And sometimes you maybe don't build them quite as nicely as you might want them to be because we don't give you the right sort of tools to do it. And so we decided that we needed to really double down on this. And we started to go out and evaluate what other frameworks were giving you. So we looked at React, and React gives you like 41 base components out of the box. And we looked at Polymer, and they've got 34. We looked at Visualforce, which clearly is used by a lot of you. And guess what? There's 153 of those. So there's a lot of those guys out there. And we also looked at the Lightning Design System, because one of the things we quickly found over and over again was that a person might try to do something in the Lightning Design System and say, why isn't that very same thing a component that I can just use? And there were 81 of those. The reason, by the way, there's so many in the Visualforce namespace here is because Visualforce, it basically went really broad and wide. It kind of did a big spray over the 10 years that it's existed. And it actually turns out only about 61 of them are used by most everybody in the room. And there's a whole bunch that are in the long, long tail. We also went out and we talked to you, our developers. We talked to you at events like this, in user groups, and also in some of the forums to understand which types of components were giving you the most pain. And from that, we created a sort of roadmap, if you will, of components that we felt like we needed to build. And you'll see we were making some progress here from the summer to the winter 17 release. We basically doubled the number of components. That was the last time we did a surge on components. And then we started adding a few and a few and a few. And that was not enough. That was not what we needed to do. And so in this last release that's going to be coming out in winter 18, we really surged again. And what do I mean by surge? So our team here, the Lightning Foundation, we're a certain size. But we wanted really help from all of the different clouds. So Sales Cloud and Service Cloud and the Analytics group and the Search group and all these different groups all sort of pitched in, and everybody started building components that we had put together to spec. So we believe that we're going to have a very rich set of components starting in the winter 18 release. I'll show you what some of those are in a second. And we believe that that's going to help bring us to parity with SLDS. So the idea would be, if you look in SLDS, you should be able to find a corresponding component that already exists. Now, not everything is in SLDS that people want. So, for example, there's no chart component inside of SLDS, but like pretty much everybody wants to be able to put a chart on their page. Or there's no map component inside of SLDS, but again, that's something that like kind of everybody needs. So there's a few more of those, and those are the types of things that we'll be adding in the spring release as well. So what are these types of things that we're talking about? So in the summer release that just came out, that's a sort of definitive list of things that came out. They're not necessarily very complicated things, just as individual Legos are not very complicated things. But in the winter 18 release, we believe that we're going to deliver some of the very interesting and meaningful components for you guys. For example, input field and output field. We already have Lightning Input. Lightning Input is basically like Salesforce agnostic. You can just stick any data you want in there, and that will be then an input field. Lightning Input field, what it does is it is tightly tied to Salesforce metadata. So you would say, here's this field from this record. Salesforce, you figure out the rest. You figure out things like FLS, and you figure out CRUD, and you figure out which values it should have, and all of that kind of stuff. So its parallel in Visualforce would be Apex input field. So there's those. You've also asked for things like data table, right? Like, why should I have to recreate tables over and over again? So we will be delivering that. Also, things like modals or notifications, sort of, brass tacks of building a UI. All of those things are coming out in the winter 18 and more. One of the big favorites I often hear about from people is upload file. How often have you guys tried to write a component and deal with the limits inside of Apex and having to break it down and do all this junk? We don't have to do that anymore. We're going to deliver to you a Lightning, I believe it's called Lightning upload file. So in any case, we again intend to make it very simple and easy for you to build with this platform. In 18, you'll see some of the things that I mentioned, many of which don't exist inside of SLDS. So we're working with that team to build out those designs, things like charts, maps, carousels, et cetera. And what I would like to say to all of you is, as we continue to deliver these components to you, please be vocal with us and tell us either A, whether or not they're delivering what you need, and B, whether or not there's new components that you're missing. Yeah? Lookup is part of input field. So the way that this, yeah, it's the same thing. So I don't know if everyone could hear, but his question was about a lookup component. So the way that lookup works in general in Salesforce, so if you were writing a Visualforce page, for example, if you said Apex input field, field type, or field equals some lookup field, then what would happen is that Salesforce would automatically render a lookup field with all of the appropriate values that has type ahead and all of that. So in this instance, the same thing will happen. There won't be a separate lookup component. We may actually, in the spring release a separate lookup component where we will add more attributes to it to make it even more configurable by you. That's a thing that we're thinking about. But that's the type of thing that we'd love to hear your feedback on. Like, great, I can do this thing with input field, but I would really like to be able to twiddle this bit or do something else with it. How many of you are building with a framework other than the ones I've been talking about? Not very many of you. All right, interesting. Well, in some audiences I talk to, it's like everybody raises their hands. There's a lot of frameworks out there, and there's new ones popping up all the time. There's two right on here, Angular and React, that are very commonly used and sometimes growing commonality. And people have often already made investments in these things. And then they come to me and they say, Ryan, do I have to port this thing over to Lightning components now in order to use it in Lightning experience? And the answer is no, you don't have to do that. Instead, what you can do is you can use this feature we have, which is called a Lightning container component. We released that earlier as a developer preview. It'll be going GA in the winter 18 release. And the idea of it is fairly simple. It's a standalone component that is itself a single-page application. So you can run your React application or your Angular application inside of that thing. And that thing itself gets put inside of a Lightning component. And that Lightning component then can be used inside of the Lightning experience just like any other Lightning component. So for example, you could put that thing inside of the app builder so that your admins could drag and drop it on the page wherever you like. It also provides messaging in between that thing and the outside world. So you could have your React application where it does something or other and then sends a message to the outside so that the outside frame can do something else. Speaking of frames, it is iframed, and in that sense is, it's in its own domain, which means that you can do other special things with it that you can't do inside of the rest of the Lightning experience. For example, you have control of the CSP. I'll get to you in one second. So CSP, content security policy. So maybe you want to do something like call out to some other external service and pull out that information. You can't do that inside of a Lightning component due to our security policies. Well, you can do that inside of a Lightning container component. So it has many, I guess I'd call it they're like yin and yang of each other. And so we're really interested to see how you guys are going to start mashing these things up together. You had a question? Yes. The last person? The locker service. So his question was, having this thing communicate to the outside, doesn't that violate the locker service? And the answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because this thing operates inside of an iframe. It's actually running on a different domain, right, than everything else. So it itself is not running inside of the locker. Visualforce pages are also not running inside of the locker. Visualforce pages are also running inside of their own iframe. The reason that we invented this concept and we didn't say, just keep on using a Visualforce page, is because Visualforce page itself is sort of like a heavyweight concept. Right? There's a lot of structure that has to build it up. It's actually quite not nearly as performant as this is as well. We also wanted to make this easier from a developer experience, a development experience, in the sense that what you actually plug in here is a static resource. So you build your Angular app or your React app. You do it however the heck you want. You do it offline, whatever. You zip it up as a static resource and bloop, throw it in here, and you're done. There's nothing else you have to do with it. Whereas a Visualforce page, of course, you're still building a server-side page and doing all that. So that's the reason we created it. But no, it doesn't run inside of the locker. The component that you stick it into, it runs inside of the locker. So you'll have to think about that and whether or not you're passing something into it and it's in a different context. But it itself does not. OK, so let's talk a little bit about Lightning services. Does this show up OK? I was wondering if it did. So you see there's some highlighted things in this box. So the Lightning data service we've been talking about for a couple of releases. We first introduced it as a developer preview, and then we made it beta. We're going to be making it GA in the winter 18 release. It's beta right now. And basically what this does, if you're familiar with Visualforce, you're familiar with the standard controller, our goal is to provide all of the types of capabilities that you could get through a standard controller and more. And so in this instance, you'll see here where it says force record data, and then it has an ID, and it says this record, and then it gives you this thing called target record, which gives you a value that you can then start passing later out through your page. And I give it a target here of the fields that I want. So what is this thing doing? What it does is it reaches to the Lightning data service, And the Lightning Data Service has all the intelligence in it to determine whether or not, A, it has it in a local cache and can just give it to you, and so it's essentially instantaneous, or B, needs to go back to the server to get the information and bring it back to the local cache, or C, has it in the local cache, but it's been there for a while, so maybe it's not good anymore, but I still want to make it instantaneous and, in parallel, go back to the server and make sure that I was right, and then update you if I was wrong. And so it does all those things at once. Because it's a local cache, it also means that it's going to be available to you offline. So if you're in Salesforce 1, the mobile application, then you can also access these things that way. Additionally, it also greatly streamlines the process of actually getting the data. You'll notice in this particular little piece of code here, I didn't actually write any Apex code at all to go and get anything. I just put in a little snippet that says what fields that I want. So I don't have to write Apex in order to do this. Additionally, this cache is available across everything. So imagine that in building my page, I have a component here and one here and another one here, and all three of them are actually operating on the same record. They can all access the same cache. So right now, when you're using Apex, what happens is that each one of those is calling to the server, getting the same data, pulling it back, and showing it. Now, for those of you who are familiar with networks and maybe making an application that's, I don't know, running in China, but the servers are over here, you want to try to have as few of those types of network hops as you can. The Lightning Data Service dramatically helps with that, because what will happen is that now all three of those components will reach to the same piece of information locally, and only one time will it go back and fetch information. It's also additive. So when you're asking for these, say, whatever 5 fields this is, if another component is, say, asking for 8 fields, what it's going to do is it's going to do the Venn diagram of it and get the extra information. So it's already got what it needs, and it'll only get you a little bit more. It figures that all out for you, and you don't have to think about it. You had a question?
Yes. You just mentioned that there's a shared cache.
Yes.
We have 3 components showing the same record.
Yes.
They will go to the same cache. Will they, how can I say this? One component updates the record. Will the other 2 components be stable?
They will not. So the question was, if I have 3 components and one of the components updates a record, will the other 2 components be stale? And the answer is no, because what happens is that it writes to the shared cache, which they all share, and so the others automatically are being updated. Yes, they will, because they are plugged directly into this thing. And additionally, behind the scenes, the Lightning Data Service is reaching to the server and updating the server so that it is correct as well. Yes? Desi, you want to answer that question? Engineering, my friend here in engineering.
If it's synchronous or the update of the records?
No, so if I have an init handler that runs on page load in addition to the force record data, will the force record data retrieve this property record by the time the init handler runs, or will I have to have a separate on-change handler to handle the retrieval of this record?
You're going to have on change, right?
Yes.
We noticed the cache behavior actually really improves the performance. However, there is a drawback where the users see the cache information first. If the cache information is updated, they see the refresh of the page. Is there a way to configure that so we can avoid that double refresh of the page?
So there isn't a way to configure that today within the Lightning experience. There is, so you guys should all understand, this technologies can be used to build many different things. You could build your own standalone Lightning app, for example, like property.app or something like that. In those containers, you do have control over refresh intervals and things like that. You could say, whatever, it's 10 seconds. In this, the cache is, I believe, 30 seconds. So in Lightning experience, you don't have that control. We essentially evaluate things and try to optimize to provide the best thing possible. But it is interesting feedback that you might want to be able to control that in the future. Yeah?
Will the data service support a set controller concept where you have multiple records? And if so, if you have one record and this one has a set, and you update this one record, would it reflect in that set?
So yes and yes. So this is actually just the reason we call this whole thing Lightning Data Service, and I didn't call it like standard controller or something like that, is it's actually going to be a whole combination of tags like this and services like this that you're going to be able to access. Force record data is just the first. There will be others in the future. And like, I don't know if the names are going to be this or not, but for example, force record collection, which would allow you to get a group of things. Additionally, another one is going to be force action lists. So you can get the list of all the actions that should show up on this page. Force object info. I want to get all the metadata about this thing. So we're going to be providing more and more of these types of tags to get access to different types of data or metadata that's available inside of Salesforce. But you really raised an interesting point, which is this is distinctly different than standard controller, because I can have many of these on a single page, a single component. Right? There's nothing in here that says like specifically it had to be some one record ID or anything like that. I could have 5 of these in here, each with a different record ID. And you could combine the things together in different ways. I'm going to keep going, because otherwise, we have questions at the end too. But I'm not going to get done otherwise. OK, so another one of the services that we're introducing is the Lightning Testing Service. So the testing service, what we heard from people is, I need a better way to be able to do sort of component level testing. Maybe I'm using Selenium to do end-to-end testing, but I'm starting to put a lot of the logic into the components itself, and I want to make sure I have automation around that. And it turns out that there's some really great frameworks out there in the world already for doing JavaScript test automation, such as Jasmine, Mocha, and many others, new flavors all the time. And so we decided we would take a cue out of the Salesforce DX book and make this something that instead of us building something proprietary that you'd have to learn and that we constantly have to evolve and build tools on top of, that we would instead integrate with open, available test frameworks that exist. And so what we've done right now is we've introduced, I believe it's a pilot of an integration with Jasmine. It's on GitHub, so you can just download this thing and check it out. And essentially what it is a testing app that will run, and integrations to make it easy for you to hook Jasmine into your components themselves. In the future, we'll look at doing things around Mocha, but a lot of things, frankly, these are just meant to be examples for you so that you could then take them and say, oh, I'm going to do this with the test framework of the month that I like. One of the big things about this is that it is integrated with Salesforce DX and continuous integration, so that when you do those cool demos where they're running off and building an org and doing all these automation, you can also have your component level automation running. So this is, we're planning to GA this in the spring release. OK, the user interface API. So Salesforce has a lot of APIs. Right? We have data APIs, we have metadata APIs, we have tooling APIs, et cetera. And when we were building the Lightning experience and the Salesforce One mobile experience, one of the things that we realized was we were doing a whole lot of API calls. We were getting tons of data for all these different components and metadata, and it was very, very redundant and very, very verbose. And we needed a way to really simplify this, as well as to take advantage of all that caching we were just talking about before. And so we built this thing called the User Interface API. And essentially, you can think of this thing as like a layer between the Salesforce core and a UI. Really any UI. It doesn't have to be our UI. And what that thing does is it allows me to do very simple calls to it to say, like, I want to create a page. And the page is about this particular record. Give me everything, all the information about that thing. I want to know all the data about it. I want to know all of the what we call object info or the metadata about it. I want to know the page layout for it. I want to know the pick list values. I want to know everything. Give it back to me in one payload so that I can then create a UI of whatever sort that I want. And in doing that, it's a single call to go and do that, not 81 different calls that have to be orchestrated. And so we use this user interface API ourselves to create the Lightning experience and to create the Salesforce One mobile experience. And you can use this same thing yourself to create other experiences. They could run on top of our technology or not. They could run on Heroku or Azure or whatever the heck you want. It doesn't matter. It's just an API. So this is a new thing that's available currently in developer preview. We will be GAing this in our winter release. And we think that this is a really amazing new technology, especially also because of all those caching benefits that we were talking about in the Lightning Data Service. So there's two complements to that. There's caching that's done on the server side, which is done at a profile level. And there's caching that's done on the client side, which is done at a user level. So on the client side, as a user, I come in, I get a particular record, I go to another thing, it's already there for me, right? It's in this cache. But that doesn't help my friend Desi, who's working on her machine over there. But we're part of the same group. We have the same profile. Because I've gone and got that information before, it's in the server-side cache, so that when she gets it, that's already being served up and much faster for her. And so one of the really interesting benefits of this, and a significant difference over trying to construct this and orchestrate all those APIs itself, is that actually as the system has more users and more actually frequency of use, actually the performance of the system improves, which seems sort of weird and counterintuitive, but it's what we see. Salesforce has the worst performance on weekends when nobody's on it, because nobody's priming it for one another, which is something we're trying to think about, like how can we intelligently prime this for you, guess what you might want to be doing instead. But if you use this user interface API, you get those same benefits in the UI that you create. OK, I'm going to give you an eye chart at the end. So I really only talked about highlights. There are many other things that we're delivering. You'll see some of the many things that we delivered in the past. A couple just quick ones I'll mention on here. We're going to be introducing component save validations. So right now, when you write a component, you could write complete garbage inside of that component and hit save. And then, whatever, it saves and it's super fast. But then you go over and you run it in the runtime, and you're like, blows up in your face. And you're like, what? Then you go back and you mess with it again, and you have to go back to the runtime, and it blows up in your face again. So we don't want that to happen anymore. We want to try to help you with that. So we're going to have the first version of component save validations going on. So we'll actually be making sure that what you're putting in there is syntactically correct and doesn't violate various things. It's a first pass, guys. So there'll be evolving rules over time. And this is the type of thing that, again, feedback from you will be really helpful. If you said, this is a thing that's constantly catching me, that the save validation is not catching for me, can you please add that? So please be vocal about that. Another item on here that I'll mention just real briefly is support for libraries. So today, we've written a great blog post that talks about how to use libraries. We don't really have official support for JavaScript libraries today. What we do is we suggest that you create a static resource and stick it in there and then reference it from multiple places, or sometimes create essentially a headless component that you don't actually intend to display on a page and then reference that in multiple places. We're going to provide something that's more of like an official library type of concept for you to use. And initially, what we'll be doing is we'll be exposing some of our own libraries for you to use, and then making it so you can generate your own libraries and share them with one another. So those are just a couple of other highlights. Since I was answering a lot of questions in the middle, I decided I wouldn't save as much time at the end. Yes, you have a question in the back?
I actually have 3 questions.
3 questions, great.
First question, I did look at the blog about Visualforce Lightning. Is there a defined standard, though, about communication between Visualforce and Lightning? Because there are a lot of theoretical ways to do it that work differently, but is there a best practice or a defined way to do that?
So the question was, is there a best practice around doing Visualforce and Lightning component communication? So what I would say right now is that the blog post has the best practice in it. But that is actually something that we're looking at making essentially a first-class citizen of Visualforce, is messaging to Lightning itself. That's probably not coming in the next 2 releases, but it is something that we're thinking a lot about. And actually, we're thinking about making that messaging layer something that would common between Visualforce, Lightning container components, and Canvas, all of which are varying forms of iframes and content that want to be able to communicate back and forth.
And then with data service, how do lookups work with data service? You have single record data service and multiple. Is that multiple in terms of lookups? Like if I have a bunch of lookups to a single the record that I'm pulling with data service.
So So I'm not entirely sure if I'm understanding your question, but there will be a separate input field component for handling lookup. It itself, in turn, uses the data service, but you don't have to think about it. Yeah, you had a question. Yes, so the question was, are we thinking about the evolution of Lightning with ES6 or ES7 or TypeScript or things like that? And the answer is yes, we are always thinking about these types of things. The industry's moving a lot. Like if you think about where it was 4 or 5 years ago and where it is today, it's dramatically different. So yeah, we are absolutely looking at that with a close eye and would love your feedback about specific features of those protocols and standards that you think are so amazing and empower you. Which ones of the types of things are things you'd like us to adopt? Yeah, in the back of there. You, yes. Yes. I would say eventually, but it's going to take a long time. So, and the reason we would do that is to try to limit confusion. It's existed for a long time. It is in most ways duplicative and in most ways inferior. So generally speaking, you should use things in the Lightning namespace first if there is something that looks parallel in the UI namespace. There are a few things that only exist in the UI namespace. We will give you a very long head start to knowing when we're going to be moving towards deprecation. I believe it's only on the object itself. But you can, like I said before, you can pass whatever record ID you want into it. So for example, you could, in an Apex controller, go and get the ID of the related record, and then do a force record data on it with that ID and get whatever fields you want. Yeah?
What we do differently to be able to use these
In macros. You're talking about Service Cloud? I will have to get back to you on that. I don't know the answer. I'm not familiar enough with how macros work. Sorry, go ahead.
Using standard components inside Lightning components, it's not possible. There is something that you're looking forward to.
What do you mean by standard components?
The app builder has on the left standard components.
OK.
Take them and use them. Cool.
Yes, so his question was, some of the components that I see in like the left-hand side of the app builder are not available to me programmatically. I can't stick them in my code. And the answer to that is, yes, that's true today, because there are different properties as to whether or not it can be exposed in app builder or it can be programmatically exposed. What I would suggest, again, is that you ask for specific ones of those components that you want programmatically available. We are trying to add more and more of them. I know you want all of them. But you build software as well as I do. Help me with a prioritized list. One of the things that we do plan to work on is, for example, a lists component. So like that's a thing that's actually it's not over there, but it's going to be over there in the next release. And then in the release after that, it's going to be made programmatically available to you. So if you can help us by saying, I really, really need this one, and then this one, and then this one. Just tell me what you want. In the back.
This is kind of a related question. Is there anything on the roadmap for let's say you have these basic components, you close them together programmatically, but having custom components that compose inside of each other in the UI as an add, that creates a wrap of components that I can drop in, and then I can let it add and drop in components.
Yeah, no, that's. So the question for all of you is, essentially, can I create container regions inside of, say, an app builder so that I can have an admin who can put other components inside of that? That is on the roadmap. It's not in the next 2 releases. It is a little bit further out, but it is something that we know people want and would be very powerful. You in the blue shirt. No. We do not plan to do that right now. What we discovered with Apex and Apex tests was that a lot of you guys said, screw it, I know what's best for me, and I wrote really, really shitty tests, and I just, made it to pass the 75%. And we don't want to do that. What we're trying to say, you guys are big boys and girls. You write code that's going to work for you and your business with your needs, and we'll give you the tools, but we won't try to mandate things. Yeah.
You mentioned a property on the exchange against the help but is it context aware so that if the page is used in a lightning context, it can apply other styles, but if it's still a classic page context, it knows not to?
Yes, it is. And so I'm trying to remember exactly how this works. It either only works in the Lightning context, like it's not available to you at all in the classic experience. I can't remember if it is exactly that or if it is a, in any case, it's like a programmatic thing. So just like you can right now say any one of those attributes at the top equals some variable that you calculate and say, okay, now the variable is true or false. You can do the same thing with this as well. So you could make it so that if you looked up UI theme equals 4T, which is the tablet view of this thing, apply it or don't apply it. That's a way in which you can control it. I mean, it's automated, and you could just write equals true, and it would always be on if that's what if that meets what your requirement is. Some people will not want that, right? They'll. Let me follow up, because I can't remember. We debated quite a lot as to whether or not to apply this in the classic experience or not at all, because there were some technical challenges related to that. But I'll have to find out the answer. Maybe you can give me your email address after this is over. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sure. One more question. Okay.
When you do the input field, please make it support those polymorphic lookup classes.
Yeah. Yeah, we have that on the plan.
Just like the Apex one. Thank you very much.
Yeah. There's 4 crazy variations of it. There's desktop versions and mobile versions and polymorphic and single lookup and multi lookup. There's a lot of variations, which is one of the reasons it's taking us a long time to build.
And also, will you be able to indicate which field that data might to another variable, like you do in Apex, in classic? You can say, you'll be able to put any field here, and the field I'm showing is driven by this other field.
So the way that we plan to do this, you correct me if this is wrong, is essentially when you put the tag on the page, you're telling it what record ID and what field and where that information came from is up to you and your logic. I think I have to close this down because someone is going to run me off the stage in a second here. I'll be over here on the side, and you can answer a few more questions. Thank you again for coming.